It's not for everybody. Guess what? They are going to rip your face off. If you're a precious flower, you're going to be in the wrong line of work.
I believe that what the Australian people are looking for is a positive vision for the nation's future.
Padre, can you hear any such voices now?
The free marketplace of ideas is basically just good thinking.
I'm sure I have forwarded things that are every bit as poorly executed as that video was.
The name Mesopotamia was likely coined by Alexander the Great when he absorbed what is now Iraq into the Greek Empire in 331 BC, and as such, the term comes from ancient Greek and translates as between two rivers. Due to the term's application in this particular area, however, it took on a more specific meaning, defined by the historian Arrian as the land situated between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in his Anabasis of Alexander. This region, however, was originally much more than a mere satrapy of an empire, for it was the valleys of these two rivers that would witness the dawn of civilization itself. Following the last ice age, the Levant was covered by grasslands, which were to gradually succumb to desertification as the ice caps retreated. As was the case with the Nile in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded annually, allowing for a fertile valley area in the midst of a land of desert, where primitive forms of wheat and barley could be sown. The lower end of this valley area has been irrigated since around 6000 BC, due to the unreliable amount of rainfall in the area. The north, being a more mountainous area, had higher levels of rainfall, and consequentially likely had a higher population density and less incentive to develop. The earliest Mesopotamian settlements, and indeed some of the world's earliest settlements, were found near swamps, lakes, or streams fed by the southern Euphrates. Such settlements were seasonal, collections of mud huts built by nomadic peoples to protect themselves from winter weather around 5800 BC. Of course, this by definition makes them semi-nomadic, and the development of copper tools also marked the end of the Neolithic Age and the beginning of the Copper Age, though certain discoveries in far-off lands have led us to question whether it really began here. Settlements, irrigation, and cultivation of edible plants allowed agriculture to develop, and while this was going on, animals around the settlements began to be domesticated for their labor, as well as sustenance and clothing. From here, there was a slow process over which people increased their reliance on the resources they managed directly, while still supplementing aspects of their diet with hunting and gathering. Walls and shrines were some of the first permanent structures erected by communities across the Levant, but architectural developments gradually incorporated permanent dwellings as well. Settlements now began to be made up of people living there all year round, forming villages. These permanent settlements furthered advancements in tools, weapons, ceramics, and textiles. Bands of 3.5 meter reed were used as the framework for most homely buildings, though more complex structures were mainly sun-dried mud brick. This mud brick, and in more prestigious buildings, imported stone, eventually replaced reed structures entirely. Mesopotamia's buildings were flat-roofed and painted in clay. They featured the world's first columns and arches, and many also included stairs, vaults, buttresses, and drainage systems. By 4000 BC, the peoples of Mesopotamia were largely settled farmers. People migrating from less successful settlements to more prosperous ones aided population growth, and by around 3000 BC, cities of clay and mud brick such as Eridu, Ur, Uruk, Lagash, and Kish had formed. The south of Mesopotamia, and its many developing city-states, had come to be known as Sumeria, while the north was populated by the Semitic Akkadians, and as such, northern Mesopotamia was referred to as Akkad. Akkadians and Sumerians were not considered distinct ethnic groups, However, they did speak different languages, as the Sumerian language is thought to have come from a large wave of migrants from southern Iran. What culturally united these groups was the polytheistic religion they both practiced and the script they had both began to use. A pictographic writing system was developed on baked clay tablets, the first of its kind in the world. This gradually evolved into cuneiform script, which was used for records of commerce as well as wisdom literature and epic poems, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, commonly cited as the first written story in the world. The state of Mari would go on to establish a library amassing 20,000 Sumerian cuneiform tablets. A great many things were invented in Mesopotamia, and it's probably fastest to simply list the main ones here. Mesopotamians are thought to have invented the wheel, allowing for carts and chariots, the sail, allowing for faster boats, the plough, allowing for more efficient farming, beer and wine, allowing people to get completely sloshed, literacy, assisting in trade, recording and accounting, numeracy, assisting in trade, recording and accounting, astronomy, history, debating, schools, aquariums, standing armies, cylinder seals, and seconds, minutes and hours thanks to the sexagesimal counting system. Bronze tools and weaponry were developed, launching Mesopotamia into the Bronze Age circa 3200 BC. Each city had its own patron god or goddess, and as a temple was considered the house of a god, they all had temples at their center. Many of Mesopotamia's most important cities were built around pre-Sumerian cult centers, and temple estates developed in settlements as priestly property was expanded upon by land donated by the people to ensure the continued goodwill of their deities. By 2600 BC, land rights were no longer universal, and much of the land of Mesopotamia was owned either by said temple estates or the palace, that being, in effect, the state. The interests of temple and palace could clash, however they were interlinked, as city rulers often came from temple administrations, and temple administrations could themselves be puppets of the palace. Slaves were originally sourced from prisoners of war, though a slave class soon developed, meaning that slaves could be of any age or gender, and people such as convicts could also be reduced to slavery. Slaves, insofar as they were property, had no rights and could theoretically be killed by their owners. Slaves could often own property and slaves themselves, though these things were ultimately possessed by their owners. Slaves received the same rations as free workers, and were often no worse off economically. While slaves were bought or sold within states, they were never a particularly important part of the economy, and weren't exported or imported between states. Slaves could be owned by the temple or privately, though many families did not own slaves, and many instead used hired labor. Villeins were a class with more rights than slaves, but less than free citizens. Immigrants and the economically disadvantaged largely birthed the villain class, which greatly outnumbered slaves. Like slaves, they were unable to leave the property on which they worked, though unlike slaves, a villain could not be bought or sold. I've grouped these two social groupings together as non-citizens. Other than slaves and villains, Mesopotamian states also had free citizens, who could own or inherit land. The free citizens can basically be divided into those who owned land and those who didn't. The latter made up most of the skilled labourers of a settlement, and so I've called these social groups free workers and free landowners. Workers often became craftsmen and lived in workshops built within temple sites, though they could also become fishermen, healers, or teachers. There was another class above the landowners, which I would call the aristocracy. This class was comprised of palace and temple officials, such as scribes, priests, and royals. Sectors of palace or temple land were often allocated to individuals of the respective institutions, and such allocations could sometimes be inherited. Rulers were, of course, the most powerful of any given state. Schools were largely devoted to the officials, and along with literacy and numeracy, Sumerian schools taught subjects such as law, medicine, and astrology. Many scribes destined merely for account keeping only learnt basic arithmetic, while others also learnt algebra and geometry. Schools educated their pupils through rote learning, and memorizing the contents of a tablet to recite it the next day was a typical practice. One was expected to honor one's elders and maintain a sense of civic duty in Mesopotamia, regardless of class or education, and the concept of an occupation was synonymous to one's contribution to their community. Both genders were expected to work, and were allowed their own businesses and contracts, and both genders could own land. Gold, silver, and copper were used as currency in Mesopotamia, though the south lacked important natural resources such as strong timber, stone, and metal ores, so Sumerians had to trade for these goods. Sumerians are thought to have frequently traded with people from across the Zagros Mountains, from whence many migrants to Sumer were thought to have come. Bronze, which is made from an alloy of tin and copper, was common throughout Mesopotamia by the 3rd millennium BC, and around the Middle East, tin was only known to be available in deposits of modern Afghanistan. Lapis lazuli, commonly featured in Mesopotamian cylinder seals and art, also came from there, which of course indicates far-reaching trade routes. Phoenician seafarers were used to establish trade routes to Arabia and the subcontinent, useful for commodities such as copper, which likely came from modern Oman, and carnelian, which comes from India. As Mesopotamian states were largely agrarian, exports were mainly textiles, wool, and grains. Prior to kings, priestly rulers are believed to have dictated the law according to religious precepts. The role of an En was established after 3600 BC, in the late Copper Age, and involved a monarch who enjoyed supremacy over the religious and political spheres, and exercised absolute control over their people through direct laws. The En was considered a representative of the gods, and they were judged on how well they maintained the welfare of their people and the prosperity of their kingdom. All great deities had spouses, and as a city's ruler acted as the spouse of its patron god, the ruler always had to be the opposite sex of the deity in question. A city's ruler lived in a special chamber called a Gipparu, which contained the bed symbolizing the sacred marriage of ruler and god. The ruler's marriage was renewed annually by sexually interacting with a priest or priestess, who acted as a representative for the local god, as this ensured fertility and abundance in the settlement. Military officers often stood in for kings, though this was separate to he who was chosen to lead his state into war, who was known as a Lugal, a man of great status and character who often did consolidate his power to become En. An Ensi was a minor or temporary city ruler, or originally one who coordinated the agricultural sector of a settlement. Estates could be and often were enlarged by the palace and by private actors by creating irrigation canals to make uncultivated land available for agriculture. By the end of the 3rd millennium BC, Ens had near absolute power, with landowning families claiming dominion over smaller and smaller shares of land. Sargon of Akkad, and no, I'm not talking about the neckbeard, was thought to have created a unified kingdom of Sumer and Akkad around 2350 BC to control irrigation. This was likely the world's first multinational realm, and from here, the history of Mesopotamia is basically just a cyclical rise and fall of empire. The Akkadian kingdom was destroyed by the Gutians, a mountain people from the northeast. From 2113 on, the Sumerians began to regain their autonomy from the Akkadians and rebuild their cities. Semitic Amalekites from Persia and Amorites from the northwest then invade Sumeria. Around 2100 BC, Amorites found Babylon, and they found Assur around 2000 BC. In 1792 BC, a man named Hammurabi becomes king of Babylon, and he moves north into Assyria, west toward the Mediterranean, and south toward the Persian Gulf to found an impressive Babylonian empire, which is to last less than half a century. Babylon became a Mesopotamian cultural center of intellectual pursuit under Hammurabi's Code of Laws, a comprehensive set of written laws in a great variety of areas of life. Hammurabi was thereby acting as an arbiter of morality for his empire, in a way which had never been seen before. He altered the structure of Mesopotamian religion, making Babylon's patron god, Marduk, head of the Sumerian pantheon, and centering religion around Babylonia's Asaglia temple. 7-day weeks and 4-week months were introduced, and iron ore was mined, allowing for the Iron Age. Babylon was then ransacked by the Hittites, who used iron for warfare. The Hittites were succeeded by the Kassites, who came from the Zagros Mountains. The Elamites drove the Kassites out and in turn gave way to the Aramaeans. In the midst of these shenanigans, a set of Assyrian kingdoms developed in the north, and 6 centuries after King Hammurabi, the people of Assur conquer the fractured remains of the Babylonian Empire to form the Assyrian Empire. Around 1200 BC, most Mesopotamian states deteriorated, but by 1100, the Assyrians controlled territory from the Mediterranean to Anatolia. The Assyrian Empire's overextension, combined with their constant waging of wars and rebellion of captive peoples, eventually led to their demise. The empire faced attacks on central cities by the likes of Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians. The Babylonians and the Medes allied to overthrow the Assyrians, attacking the capital, which had been relocated to Nineveh in 612 BC. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar forged a Neo-Babylonian empire in the south and west of the former Assyrian territory, while the Hittites consolidated the Neo-Hittite Empire. King Nebuchadnezzar oversaw the construction of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, under which the Ishtar Gate could be found, a reconstruction of which is shown here. Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Mesopotamia from King Belshazzar in 539 BC, sacking Babylon and integrating Mesopotamia into Achaemenid Persia as a province or satrapy. In 311 BC, Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, Hellenizing the region, which had already lost all knowledge of its cuneiform script, and thereby its culture in general. While once a fertile cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia is now an arid wasteland due to over-farming, urban development, and conflict. Essentially, the whole area just got completely dunked on, and it's never quite been the same since.